is our 10th talk, Filibuster Palooza, with Senator Richard Blumenthal. This is a continuation of our quest to understand all the issues surrounding the filibuster, voting procedures, and how to get things accomplished in an evenly split Senate and a not very bipartisan Washington. Richard Blumenthal is senator for all of us who live in Connecticut. Along with his wife, Big Tenter Cynthia, he's been a leading advocate for reproductive rights here and nationwide. And in the Senate, he's on the Judiciary, Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, and Commerce committees. The Blumenthals are parents to 4 children, Claire and David, who are about to finish law school, Connecticut State Representative Matt Blumenthal, and Michael, a former Navy SEAL turned Nashville singer and songwriter. So imagine the conversations at their dinner table. Senator Blumenthal will talk for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to all of them. And now, Senator, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you to Steve and you for your friendship and your support for so many very profoundly significant causes. And to everybody on this call, I see so many very, very good friends. I'm not going to say old friends, long-standing friends. And I know that most of you are familiar with what I will say in opening. So I'm going to try to be shorter than 20 or 30 minutes and then take your questions, which I think probably are going to be more illuminating than what I say at the start. But Cynthia is on the call to correct me when I stray too far or make any errors. And I think my Chief of Staff, Joel Kelsey, also should be on the call. So I may turn to them when I am unable to answer any of your questions. Let me sort of begin with a very personal note on the filibuster. I said when I first ran for the United States Senate that I would support abolishing the filibuster. And in fact, one of my very first votes, I think it might have been my third, back in 2011, was to abolish the filibuster. I then took several other votes to modify it in various ways. I was one of only 17 members of the United States Senate to vote to abolish the filibuster. So a majority of Democrats voted against it and Republicans. And one of my Democratic colleagues said to me at the time, Pat Leahy of Vermont, you know, you'll be sorry that we abolish the filibuster if we do, because there are going to be a lot of things that you will want to stop, very important things that you'll want to stop, and you won't be able to do it. And I have actually, as a leader on reproductive rights, used the filibuster to lead an effort to block defunding Planned Parenthood and all kinds of restrictions on reproductive rights and in other areas where other civil rights and liberties were concerned. So I note this sort of personal point to say that both sides have used it. And we have used it, in my view, to block invasions and intrusions on fundamental rights and liberties, measures that are against the public interest. But the reason that we are at this point now is that it has been so abused and overused by the other side. Just as a historical note, since the 1970s, the numbers have increased exponentially every year that it has been used. So it is now effectively a means to block action on almost anything. And it is used now against almost anything, although the filibuster can no longer be used to stop nominations or federal judgeships, district courtships, and circuit courtships, and beginning with the last 3 of the Supreme Court nominees, any Supreme Court justices. But the supporters of the filibuster invoke this idea of protecting minority rights and talk about how deeply rooted it is in our history. In fact, as you know, it has no deep roots in our history. The founders actually were in favor of majority rule. Just to give you a little historical perspective here, you'll remember that the present system of government grew out of the Articles of Confederation. In fact, they were ineffective because they required unanimity among the states, and the founders specifically rejected any limit on majority rule in the United States Senate or the House. I want to read you what Alexander Hamilton had to say. I realize he's sort of in vogue these days. Quote, "The necessity of unanimity in public bodies or of something approaching towards it has been founded upon a supposition that it would contribute to security, but its real operation is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority." Thomas Jefferson, in the Rules of the Senate, said the following: "The voice of the majority decides, for the lex majoris partis is the law of all councils, elections, etc., were not expressly otherwise provided." So, this idea that somehow the filibuster is a part of the fabric of our legislative process is absolutely bogus. There was, in fact, a rule that debate could be terminated by moving the question under the Senate rules until 1806, when Aaron Burr decided, as a method of simplifying the rules, they were going through some of the Senate rules and trying to make them clearer, they would eliminate that provision. And so there was no limit on debate, none whatsoever, until 1917. Often senators would take the floor, several of them, but none actually used it. Even though they delayed, they never used it to actually block action by the United States Senate, even though there was no limit on debate, until 1917. And in that year, Woodrow Wilson proposed the act that would enable American commercial ships to be armed against the German U-boats. And at that point, Senator La Follette went to the floor, along with a minority of opponents of Wilson's measure. They were isolationists at the time. They said, we don't want any risk of entry into the war. They opposed Wilson's measure, and they actually succeeded in blocking the proposal until the next Congress. And in that year, a 3/5 rule was adopted. 67 votes were required to, 2/3 rule was adopted, so 67 votes. And as a result, that threshold was imposed to end the filibuster. The rule was changed again in 1974, so it was reduced to 60 votes. And in that year also, the requirement for that threshold to be among senators present and voting was also eliminated, which is important to the proposals that have made, some of them going forward, about how many senators would have to be present if there were reform as opposed to abolition. So here we are. The rule is 60 votes. Since in the years 1917 to 1970, there were roughly 49 votes to end the filibuster. In other words, the filibuster was invoked 49 times, which is less than one a year. And in the first 4 years of the Obama administration, it was invoked 250 times. since the 1970s, it's been invoked on the average of 80 times a year, and probably more, that's the average, probably more in more recent Congresses, which in effect blocks anything from being done. I think we've reached the point where under the present distribution of power, a Democratic president, a Democratic majority in the House, and Democratic control in the Senate, there is an overwhelming sense of momentum to do something. And the question is what? Now, a number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle still feel the traditions of the Senate are important, that the filibuster promotes bipartisan consensus, that it protects the rights of the minority. They're reluctant to change the filibuster by abolishing it completely. And they'd have to be persuaded that progress was impossible without reform. And I think that is the next step. For example, voting rights, which cannot be done by the process of budget reconciliation. Everybody familiar with the American Rescue Plan, as you know, the budget reconciliation process is a budget fiscal process, goes through the Budget Committee, provides for 51 votes for taxes. That's the way that then President Trump passed his tax cuts. It is the way that the American Rescue Plan was adopted and could be used potentially for an infrastructure program, but it can't be used for voting rights. It can't be used for gun violence protection. I've just come from a hearing, by the way, on gun violence protection in the Judiciary Committee. My subcommittee is beginning a series of hearings on gun violence protection because I think we've reached a pivotal point, really a potential dawn of a different era on gun violence protection because we have majorities in Congress, because we have a strong grassroots movement, because a vast majority of the American people want gun violence protection, because President Biden has stated very unequivocally and passionately that he wants to see gun violence protection move forward, and because we have a majority leader in the Senate who says, we're gonna have a vote. But it can't be done by budget reconciliation, nor can protection of voting rights. We have seen the restrictions coming out of Georgia, Arizona, New Hampshire that would tremendously restrict mail balloting, early voting, other measures that have been adopted in the majority of states, but now will be restricted in some states because, without trying to be partisan here, Republican legislatures see it as a way to win back the United States Senate. And so I think what's happening today in the Senate in terms of filibuster reform has to be seen as part of a historical movement to protect voting rights of all Americans in all states, and to give the majority some voice and power in moving forward measures that are vital to the national interest. Now, I will just say, as a qualification to everything that I've said, you should know bipartisanship is far from dead in the United States Senate. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, as Sue has said. Every year we produce a defense bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. It is approved overwhelmingly by the Armed Services Committee. It contains all kinds of bipartisan amendments. And then it is approved generally on time before the end of the year, every year for the past 20 or so years by an overwhelming bipartisan majority of the Senate. Same is true of Veterans Affairs. I'm on that committee. We've produced Agent Orange protections, a new GI Bill, employment programs, better health care. You don't read about it or hear about it because it doesn't involve a fight. The media, with all due respect, and basically the public love a fight, but bipartisanship in the Veterans Affairs Committee is a state of mind, and likewise in armed services. And I am going to be chairing this year the subcommittee on consumer protection in the Commerce Committee. I'm hoping we'll have a lot of bipartisan action to protect consumers, which when I was Attorney General was traditionally a bipartisan cause. I'm really hoping we'll have bipartisan agreement on an infrastructure bill. I hope we would have it on the American Rescue Plan. And I was really disappointed. I'm sure President Biden was even more disappointed that we couldn't have bipartisan action, but we need to move forward. And I will just conclude by saying the most common question I get as I go around the state of Connecticut is, why can't you guys get things done? Why can't you guys get things done? And you know why it is so difficult with the requirement for a supermajority, 60 votes, in a time of highly polarized partisanship, where unfortunately the agenda is often to win seats, both in the House and the Senate, in the next election. And so the jostling and the contention begins the day after the election. The fundraising begins the day after the election. And so does the partisanship. And I'm still hoping we'll have bipartisan agreement on some measures involving gun violence prevention. For example, risk warrants or emergency risk protection orders. I did a bill with Senator Graham the session before last. I hope to do another with him. We have universal background checks, safe storage, Ethan's Law, as well as other kinds of common sense protection, a ban on ghost guns. Connecticut has them all. Connecticut has shown they work to reduce deaths by gun violence, including suicides. Taking guns or separating people from guns if they are dangerous to themselves or others is a very important principle, and I hope we can have bipartisan agreement on. But we need to move forward on infrastructure, just as we did on the American Rescue Plan. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, a healthcare crisis. We are still in the midst of an economic crisis, and Americans are asking, why can't you get stuff done? And so I think there's an imperative here for filibuster reform. It could take various forms, not just abolishing the filibuster, but also making it a talking filibuster. In other words, requiring that whoever goes to the floor be required to actually talk. If you're going to talk a bill to death, you ought to be there to talk, and requiring senators to be there, not just one senator, but enough senators so that there is real, as the saying goes, pain exacted for their having to prolong debate. And then, even if 60 votes were required, maybe it would be not 60 votes, but a 2/3 majority of the senators present and voting, which would put a tremendous burden on the minority if it wanted to block a measure that the majority wanted. We can talk about those proposals in detail, but let me stop there and take your question.
Great, thank you. Most of the questions have to do with right now, but I do want to take you back to the history just for one question. The first question we had from John Cooper, and just to elaborate on it a little bit, that Harry Reid gets the blame for starting this whole thing by creating an exemption for lower court approvals. If he had not done that, do you think McConnell would have taken advantage of it and still removed it for the Supreme Court? And what really is your opinion on whether Harry Reid is to blame for all this? Because he gets blamed by people on both sides, as they say. So can you just put that in context a little bit?
Absolutely. So it's a tough question. And to give Harry Reid credit, what he faced was an implacable wall of filibusters against President Obama's proposed nominees for the federal bench. Now, you know, some of you have heard me talk about what Mitch McConnell did when he got into the majority and President Trump was proposing nominees, because he packed the federal courts. The Senate operated as a conveyor belt. I feel that Mitch McConnell would have eliminated that threshold regardless of what Harry Reid did. Just as I feel, by the way, that Mitch McConnell is likely to eliminate the filibuster regardless of what we do if he is ever in the majority. Because I think that is kind of what he will do as a tactician and as a very shrewd and wily and canny user of the Senate rules and eliminator of the rules that don't work in his favor. So Harry Reid faced this need to confirm judges, and you know, you can argue that President Obama didn't push hard enough, didn't propose enough nominees, but until Harry Reid acted to eliminate the 60 vote threshold for those nominees, they were being stalled. And I think that in retrospect, maybe he opened the door, but I think the door would have been opened by Senator McConnell in any event. And as you will recall about his eliminating the 60 vote threshold for Justice Gorsuch, he did it with great alacrity. He didn't wait for very long. As soon as the vote went against him, he moved to eliminate the 60 vote threshold. It was called at the time the nuclear option because it was recognized that it would open the door to other similar eliminations of the 60 vote threshold. But I sincerely believe that Mitch McConnell would have eliminated it anyway.
So a lot of people are talking about creating specific lanes for specific legislation. So to get the Voting Rights Act passed, just make another, just like for financial legislation, you don't need the 60 votes, do the same thing for the Voting Rights Act. And you could do that for every really important piece of legislation that comes up, but then you might as well abolish the filibuster, because that's what you're essentially doing, saying if it's important enough, we will create a lane. What do you see as the acceptable balance between getting rid of the filibuster, which might be a more difficult sell, and creating lanes that seem important enough to go to the trouble and also, all right, we'll just do that. And then I have another.
The Senate can do whatever it wants with its rules. It could eliminate the filibuster on voting rights. It could eliminate the filibuster for the minimum wage. As you know, the minimum wage was taken out of the American Rescue Plan because it was ruled inappropriate by the parliamentarian for a budgetary measure. That criterion is often in contention. People wanted the parliamentary's ruling to be challenged, and if it were challenged and a majority of the Senate voted to overrule her, it could have been included, but it would have, in a sense, created an exception that swallowed the rule. And that is the prospect or the effect, whether it's an intended consequence or not, of eliminating the filibuster as to one bill, no matter how virtuous and important that bill, it would in effect completely eliminate that gate, because every bill is important. I mean, unless you take renaming post offices, which go through on unanimous consent, and other bills do go through on unanimous consent, most bills would face that 60 vote threshold. And so I think that you would have to accept that eliminating as to one issue, one bill, one proposal would be eliminating it for all. Now, but as I said at the very outset, the Senate can do anything it wants. If that's a fig leaf that some of the moderates are happy to adopt for voting rights, maybe it would work for that bill, and then they would just be faced on other bills with the question, why isn't this one as important as the voting rights bill?
So you just mentioned unanimous consent. Senator McConnell has threatened that he will blow that up too, that he will require, so right now, as I understand it, you open the Senate day with unanimous consent, you close it with, you do all sorts of things with unanimous consent, and he can mess that up, right? So can you talk about what his tools are to completely derail the Senate if you do get rid of the filibuster?
Scorched earth is the term he's used for the result if the filibuster is eliminated. And he potentially could, in effect, close down the Senate. I think we all remember government shutdowns in the past. They didn't really work out that well for anyone. And if he is the one who does it, and I'm just going to be really blunt here, I know we have a bipartisan group, but if Republicans are identified with shutting down the government, he is a master of the Senate rules, but he's also a pretty smart guy when it comes to politics. And I don't think he wants his Republican members who are in cycle up for re-election in 2022 to be faced with the prospect of voters saying, why did you shut down the Senate? And remember, once you jump off that cliff, it's hard to climb back up. What do you say has changed to reopen the Senate? You know, there's not too much ground for him to retreat. So I think he would be hard put to actually close down the Senate in a way that would obstruct everything. Now, he knows enough about how to operate the Senate to do something short of it. So there would be consequences for some period of time. He's not simply going to accept elimination of the filibuster, but that's another reason why reforming it rather than abolishing it might be a way to go.
Well, just still on that scorched earth, is there a way for the Senate to vote to change the rules so that he can't obstruct? Can they say, well, we're no longer opening through unanimous consent. We're no longer doing whatever these things are that he can cause trouble with. Can the Senate then vote by a 51 vote majority to change the rules that allow him to destroy it?
Great question. The answer is yes. As I said, the Senate can do anything it wants with its own rules. So it could say by a vote of the majority, the Senate will open on Monday, which is typically what we do. Monday afternoon, we all come back to Washington, D.C. We have a vote at 5:30. The Senate opens, but we'd all have to then appear on the floor just to open the United States Senate, probably at the beginning of every day. And for all kinds of things that now operate in the House, by the way, the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, because everybody agrees, you know, we really should open the Senate, go into session. It would require all of us to be his members as well as ours. In other words, this is not a cost-free threat. But yes, the Senate rules could be changed and he could be prevented. In fact, the whole procedure for unanimous consent could be eliminated. Everything would have to be done by majority rule. That could be done as well. And so many bills, I mentioned renaming post offices, declaring today Apple Pie Day, which we do, some more serious, Women's History Week, Black History Month. We do a lot of stuff by unanimous consent, and it would require a lot more time and being here. And I will just tell you, Sue, that all of these reforms on the 60 vote threshold would require more time. In other words, if there were, for example, a requirement that 2/3 of the senators voting and present be here in case of a filibuster to end debate, to achieve cloture, a lot more senators would be spending weekends here. A lot more of us would be spending nights here. You'll remember the civil rights cloture. That is what eventually brought an end to the debate. The Southern senators just ran out of steam, and they couldn't get 2/3 present voting, or they couldn't. They lacked the 40 votes. The burden was on them to produce those 40 votes. They just couldn't get senators to show up. So there are costs in terms of time, but right now, using the 60 vote threshold, as you've heard again and again, is done by the threat of a filibuster. Okay, we'll close down, we'll filibuster, and now we can leave for the weekend.
Well, it seems like it's worth a fair amount of work on the senator's part. I think we're facing similar threats to our democracy.
I agree.
So can you just talk a little bit about the process to actually make any of these happen? So we hear that Senators Manchin and Sinema are in a tough spot and not yet in favor, maybe Senator Tester, maybe others. So we just hear this in public. You talk to them behind the scenes. What do you think is the likelihood, and what kind of pressure, what sort of work needs to be done to bring them around on it?
Without sort of giving away any confidences, I've talked to both of them about it, and I think they need to be convinced that it is absolutely necessary. And that may require seeking cloture on a Voting Rights Act and having every Republican vote against it. A reasonable, thoughtful, fair measure. Every Republican votes against it, or enough to clearly deny cloture. And they may be convinced that, the future of Americans voting, it's not Republican or Democrat. It's really about absentee ballots and early voting. These rights are being willed away, in fact, scalpeled away in Georgia and Arizona. There's a case before the United States Supreme Court under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But what's really needed is reversal of the Shelby versus Holder ruling in the Voting Rights Act. And that's what HR 1 does in part. It also requires certain campaign finance reform. It guarantees rights, mail-in and absentee voting, which, by the way, Connecticut is behind in achieving, as you probably know. The rest of the country, most states are ahead of Connecticut, ironically. But put aside that issue, in most states, people take for granted that they can vote early. In Georgia, people take for granted that they can go from church to the polls. Well, it will have consequences to Americans who find it difficult to get to the polls if they work during the day, and other kinds of constraints, particularly in an era of COVID, which we were. Hopefully we won't be for much longer. But these measures have consequences, and I think it will take some of my colleagues on the Democratic side seeing that the 60 vote threshold is unachievable because of what they see is simple obstructionism, partisan political obstructionism on the part of our colleagues on the other side. And so that's what may be required for them to come over. By the way, we had a conversation last night with the president, our caucus, and President Biden seemingly recognized that a change in the filibuster rule is necessary for voting rights to be achieved, H.R. 1 and H.R. 8. And as you know, his history has been that he's opposed filibuster reform. He's been shifting in his public statements on it. I can tell you that it reflects, I think, a change of position in the White House on this issue that's very, very important, because that could be material to Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, and others seeing it more realistically. And I agree with you, Sue, the comment that you made. The threat to our democracy is so fundamental and far-reaching. It's worth any amount of time that we have to spend here in Washington, D.C. As you know, I come back every weekend. I love going around the state of Connecticut, particularly now that it's spring and so many of us in Connecticut have been vaccinated. We feel safer. I'm continuing to wear a mask, physical distancing, hand washing, all the rest. I listen to the people of Connecticut. It's probably one of the most important parts of my job, but I will stay here in Washington for as long as needed to achieve this kind of reform and then to make it work.
So I know there must be Republicans who agree with HR 1, S1, but nobody has come out for it, and it doesn't sound like anybody's going to cross over to vote for it, but maybe they would. Can you just tell us a little bit about the pressure that goes on behind the scenes to keep the caucus in line? Because Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell are both very good at it, and I'm very happy that Senator Schumer is. But because, I mean, honestly, I feel like Senator Schumer is letting people vote their conscience, and all of this is the right thing to do. This is, of course, my bias. And McConnell, I think, is holding people back from doing the right thing by not letting them vote on legislation that huge percentages of the American people want. So what does that pressure look like behind the scenes?
Hard for me to know on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, there's really very little by way of pressure. I know that Senator Manchin had some conversations with President Biden, a number of conversations. I know that President Biden reached out to others of my colleagues who had reservations about the American Rescue Plan. And I think that plan was sold on the merits. I know we're not here to talk about the pandemic or the economic crisis, but I felt very, very strongly, as did almost all of my colleagues. In fact, I'm tempted to say everyone in our caucus, that we had to go big and decisive, that it was urgent. I know there's a debate about inflation and the debt and the deficit. I'm concerned about the debt. We all have children, and we're potentially imposing a debt on them. But at this point, the investment had to be made, has to be made. We need to do more on infrastructure. I think there is a sense that we are at a pivotal point in our democracy where we have to rebuild our roads and bridges and ports and airports, daycare, childcare, the child tax credit alone. The child tax credit alone will lift half the kids in poverty now out of poverty. It is a historic, revolutionary step. And there were debates at the margins, obviously on the $15 minimum wage, on how much there should be in unemployment insurance. We don't want to create an incentive not to go back to work. There was debate on the amount of the stimulus checks and how to target them to people who really needed them. You'll recall that President Trump advocated strongly the $2,000 stimulus payment. It was a pivotal issue in Georgia. Democrats made the promise in Georgia, $1,400. We wanted to keep our promise, but more narrowly targeting the people who received it, yeah, there was some debate about it. But at the end of the day, it really was, I think, more than anything, a consensus about the need for this kind of major comprehensive action on our side. Now, on the Republican side, I'm actually pretty astonished that not a single Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. Not a single Republican. Think of it for a moment. On all of the previous pandemic bills, the CARES Act, all of the original rescue plans with Paycheck Protection Program, which this one expanded, on all the other measures. And by the way, for the most part, the American Rescue Plan extended the concepts and basic programs that had been adopted previously. They were all bipartisan. They were all approved overwhelmingly, some unanimously. And what was it about this plan? It had to be more than the fact that it was big. I think there is a sense that, forgive me, Donald Trump still controls the Republican Party. His base is still important to a Republican seeking re-election, because if nothing else, that base can defeat a Republican in a primary. We've seen the strength of that base, whether you call it a Trump cult or far right or whatever. But a lot of Republicans still feel, I would call them Trump Republicans, that Joe Biden didn't win. So I think we're in a very strange moment for the Republican Party, where it's kind of at a crossroads. And there have to be Republicans who stand up and speak out, and who are willing to break with the Trump base. And it's going to take some courage to do it. But I think that Mitch McConnell's pressure, to go directly to your question, is the result not of his necessarily threatening to withhold something from them, because he doesn't have that much to withhold in the sense of campaign contributions, although he could be significant in that way. But I think it is more the threat of that base.
Well, McConnell did try the same thing with Obama, that his goal was to keep Obama to one term by blocking all of his legislation. A lot of us here in the Big Tent care a lot about climate change. What do you think is a path for climate change legislation? Will it require another path without the filibuster? I know a lot's being done, being thrown into the infrastructure bill and all other bills, but what do you think is our best hope for climate?
A lot of it could be included in infrastructure. A lot of it could be done by executive order. I'm very proud that, just an arcane footnote here, the president has restored the Seamounts and Canyons National Marine Monument. I'm not going to embarrass you with a show of hands whether you know what it is, but it's about 5,000 square miles off the coast that has canyons as deep as the Grand Canyon, peaks as high as the Rockies. It is an invaluable area for wildlife and habitat. There are all kinds of things he could do. Trump eliminated it, Obama created it, and President Biden now has reversed Trump. And he could do that on emission standards, on other areas where climate is important. Of course, he's rejoined the Paris Agreement. And also, I think that measures can be taken in the infrastructure bill on climate. And the federal government has such power. Give you another sort of small example. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I've been pressing the Department of Defense to go all electric with its car fleet They don't use cars necessarily. They may call them Jeeps or other kinds of military term, but you know, GM is going to have an all-electric fleet at some point soon. So are other car manufacturers. The Defense Department could lead the way. It could use other technology, and a number of past military leaders, the Secretary of the Navy under Obama, advanced environmental protection as a major goal, but I've also pressed military leaders to take climate change as a matter of national security. And now in their recent strategic reviews, they include a section on climate change as a result of our pressing them on this point. You know, our military installations will be threatened. Many of them are coastal. Our bases in other countries will be threatened by unrest if there's famine. And of course, terrorism will be bred there. So the Department of Defense has recognized climate as a strategic national defense issue. So we can press on a variety of areas, but the infrastructure bill, I think, represents a major means. And then there are other climate bills that we can introduce separately where I hope there will be bipartisanship. You know, President Nixon, as you know, many of you, was the president who proposed legislation to create the Environmental Protection Agency. And when I was Attorney General, a lot of the precedents on which we relied were, take the name of a corporation, versus Bush. He defended those environmental laws. And Teddy Roosevelt was the original environmental president. So it was bipartisan. I recognize a lot has changed, but I'm hoping maybe we can go back to it.
Okay, we're almost out of time. One more question on HR 1, S1. What's your bet?
My bet is that we do something. Frankly, it's not a political calculation. I can't give you the votes. I can't predict the exact count. And I must say that it's based as much on hope as experienced, but I feel it is an imperative. Our democratic process will be so catastrophically impacted if we fail to adopt HR 1 or something like it that protects voting rights in states across the country for early balloting, mail-in voting, the ballot boxes that we have in Connecticut. You know, we can drop off your mail-in ballot so you can feel secure. Republicans in Georgia and other states want to eliminate it. I know I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but my bet is we will do something like it because I have to believe it. I have to believe it to stay sane.
Great. So what I think we're going to see for the next few months is a very partisan move by the Democrats to get important legislation through. And then, but at some point, the Democrats and the Republicans, but I'm going to put it on the Democrats because the Democrats are in power, will need to take steps to make the Senate work well again. What steps do you think can be taken that actually will help get the Senate back to being a collegial and healthy place?
I'm going to sound naive by saying I think part of the answer begins at the top. I've lived through 4 years of Donald Trump. I look back at the tweets, some of them directed at me. I look back at the utter contempt for the rule of law, the talk, the words that inflamed hatred, that fueled domestic terrorism and violent extremism, which, by the way, the FBI says is the most, I'm going to quote, persistent and lethal internal national security threat. It's not foreign terrorism, it's domestic terrorism. And if you follow the SolarWinds hack and the recent Chinese Microsoft Exchange hack, I'm not minimizing the foreign threat. But Donald Trump was toxic to civil discourse in this country. I'm really hoping, I said I was going to sound naive, that Joe Biden can restore some sense of civility. That's point number one. I think also we all wanted at some level, below the colleagues whose names are familiar to you, who objected to the vote count, there are others on the Republican side who really want to work together. And I'm hoping that turning down the heat on the kind of rhetoric that we've seen that has inflamed the right wing, domestic violent extremism, whether it's the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, Boogaloo, Proud Boys, Stand By, Charlottesville, good people on both sides. You can see a thread that runs through the last 4 years. I don't want to say it's only Trump, but without Trump, I think we'd be in a different state of mind right now. And I'm hoping that without Trump, we will be in a different state of mind a year or so. So I am hoping that before, but certainly after the midterm elections, we will see a progression. It's not going to happen all at once, but we will see a progression toward greater civility and collaboration. And, I recognize that it takes everyone working together. And if we can use the National Defense Authorization Act, the VA programs, maybe some climate change issues, I was a leader to take, again, an issue that may seem minor to you, Plum Island. We've preserved it. In my view, it was a historic victory. 1,000 acres in the middle of Long Island Sound that could have been developed for commercial purposes has now been kept free of development. It will continue to be a habitat for birds flying south, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but it was the result of bipartisan cooperation. If we can use those kind of climate steps or environmental steps to begin using the muscles and strengthening the muscles that provide for bipartisanship and change the habit of mind so it isn't immediately going to your corner, I'm hoping that we can make progress. And I'm working with a number of my colleagues. Jerry Moran has been a great partner on the College Athletes Bill of Rights. We're working with some of our Republican colleagues on privacy. I'm reaching out to some of my colleagues on both the Commerce and the Judiciary Committee on gun violence prevention. Maybe we can do something on risk warrants, emergency risk protection orders, even universal background checks. I am hoping we can take specific issues and make progress.
Thank you. So we've had a history lesson and a civics lesson, and now you've given us a little hope. So I hope all you're saying does come to pass.
And I apologize that all of it was somewhat long-winded, but
no, it was all, we are
that's
just
the occupational hazard of being a senator.
We're diving in. We're trying to learn everything we can. So thank you. Thank you for coming to the big tent, and we hope to see you here again soon.
Well, I so admire you guys. The questions were great, and I hope that I will be invited back. I hope that I haven't, knocked over my wine glass or something like that to make myself unwelcome. But I know so many of you, and I admire what you're doing and what you've done. And thank you so much for recognizing democracy is not a spectator sport. We have to be engaged and involved. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.